Judge Thorne and everyone in the courtroom thought she was just a confused old woman, until she calmly pulled out her bar card and dismantled the entire case right in front of them. Do you understand the charges against you? Or do we need to slow this down a bit? Judge Marcus Thorne didn't even try to hide the smirk in his voice. He leaned back in his high-back chair, crossed his arms, and peered down at the elderly woman standing alone at the defense table. His tone carried the same smugness he used on loudmouthed defendants who thought they could outtalk him. Except this wasn't some hot-headed street kid with baggy pants and an attitude problem. This was a 72-year-old woman in a faded blue cardigan and thick-soled orthopedic shoes, standing straight, with her hands gently folded over a worn leather handbag. Her name was Eleanor Hayes, charged with obstruction, disorderly conduct, and resisting arrest during a protest that got out of control 2 weeks ago at Bakersfield City Hall. The prosecutor, Preston Cole, couldn't have been more than 30. Clean-cut with shiny shoes and the kind of confidence that came from never being told no in his life. He shot a glance toward the gallery, grinning. Some folks in the courtroom laughed quietly. The bailiff chuckled. Even the stenographer's lips twitched. Eleanor said nothing. Judge Thorne tapped the file in front of him. Says here you pushed an officer and encouraged the crowd to resist dispersal orders. Big talk for someone your size. Another light wave of laughter. He glanced over his glasses at her. No, attorney, I take it. She finally spoke. No, Your Honor, Eleanor said, her voice smooth and low. I'll be representing myself. That caught Preston Cole by surprise. His head tilted like he'd misheard her. Ma'am, you're aware this is a criminal proceeding? You're facing real charges. Eleanor didn't blink. I'm well aware. Would you like to see my bar card? There was a pause, then a few snickers. Folks thinking she meant something else. But then Eleanor reached slowly into her handbag and pulled out a laminated card, slightly yellowed around the edges. She placed it carefully on the table and slid it forward. Thorne squinted, then leaned closer. It read, State Bar, California, Attorney Eleanor Hayes, bar number 131792. Admitted June 19th, 1983. The room went quiet. She looked up and adjusted her reading glasses. I earned my law degree from Howard in '82. Passed the bar the following summer. Spent 12 years as a public defender in Chicago, another 8 working civil rights cases here in California. No one moved. I retired in 2003, she added, but I kept my license active. Just in case. Judge Thorne shifted in his seat. Cole cleared his throat, but said nothing. Eleanor looked directly at the judge. Now, before this courtroom decides my fate, I'd like to correct the record. I wasn't leading a protest. I was trying to calm it. There's a difference, and I intend to prove that, point by point. Her tone didn't change. She didn't raise her voice, but every word landed like it had been weighed and measured before being spoken. The bailiff glanced at the judge. Thorne picked up her bar card again and turned it over, as if expecting it to crumble in his hands. But Eleanor just stood there, steady, like she'd been in that exact position 1,000 times before. Because she had. Preston Cole spoke next, his voice a little tighter now. Your Honor, we can't verify this without official. It's real, Eleanor interrupted. And I have more credentials in that bag if you'd like to see them. Cole fell silent. Judge Thorne hesitated, then finally said, Very well. The court recognizes the defendant as representing herself. He paused. Proceed. A quiet, buzz-confused, stunned pass through the gallery. But Eleanor just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to herself. She wasn't here to entertain. She was here to remind the room that what they saw wasn't always what they got. But Judge Thorne wasn't ready for what she was about to expose next. The courtroom still hadn't recovered. Judge Thorne sat a little stiffer in his chair now, watching Eleanor Hayes with a new kind of attention, one that didn't involve sarcasm. Preston Cole, once smug and lounging, now looked like someone unsure if he'd walked into a real trial or an ambush. His jaw was set, but his eyes kept glancing at the judge, as if waiting for backup. Eleanor adjusted the microphone in front of her. I'd like to begin by addressing the prosecution's claims, starting with the body cam footage. Or more specifically, the lack of it. Preston straightened. Your Honor, the footage from Officer Dempsey's body camera was deemed irrelevant due to battery malfunction. It's in the official report. Eleanor turned slightly toward the jury. A battery malfunction that lasted exactly from the moment the officers arrived at the protest until I was placed in cuffs. Convenient, isn't it? She paced slowly, thoughtfully, the way some lawyers did on television, except she wasn't acting. This wasn't for show. There are 3 officers listed in the arrest report, she said. Only one of their body cams was reviewed. The second one malfunctioned, and the third officer's footage was. What did the report say? Never uploaded due to administrative error. She stopped in front of the jury box and folded her hands. And yet, the report managed to include full transcripts of what I allegedly said, without any audio to support it. Judge Thorne looked toward Cole. Mr. Cole, is that accurate? Cole cleared his throat. We submitted the available materials, Your Honor. The absence of footage doesn't negate the officer's sworn testimony. Eleanor didn't wait. Then let's talk about that testimony. Officer Dempsey claimed I raised my fist, shouted, pushed forward, and resisted arrest by locking my arms with another protester. I've submitted 6 witness statements saying otherwise. All of them were present. All of them say I stood between the crowd and the police and asked people to back up. She pulled a folder from her bag and placed it on the table. I've also submitted a request for subpoena of Officer Dempsey's prior complaints. There are 3 related to misconduct during public gatherings. All dismissed quietly. The gallery stirred. Cole objected. Irrelevant unless those complaints led to a conviction. Eleanor turned, her voice firm. Patter matters, Mr. Cole, especially when it's the same behavior over and over. The judge raised a hand to quiet the room. Let's keep it focused to mess. Hayes. She nodded once, then lifted a second file. I also want to address the photograph the prosecution submitted into evidence, Exhibit C, the one showing me mid-step, surrounded by police. She held the printout up. They claimed this showed me moving toward the officers, preparing to resist arrest. But if you zoom in, she handed a magnified copy to the clerk. You'll see my palms are up, open, facing outward. That's a universal sign of de-escalation. She looked at the jury again. You don't march toward armed police with your hands raised unless you're trying to stop something worse from happening. The room was quiet. No laughter now. Even the gallery had shifted forward in their seats. Cole tried to regroup. Regardless of those gestures, the defendant refused a lawful order to disperse. Eleanor turned toward him slowly. What lawful order, Mr. Cole? The arrest record mentions an order given by Officer Dempsey at 6:32 p.m. I have a timestamp photo showing I was already in cuffs by 6:28. She let that sink in, which means the order was either given late or never given at all. Judge Thorne shifted, visibly uncomfortable. Preston didn't speak. Eleanor took a breath. So, if there was no audio, and the timeline is inconsistent, and the footage is missing, and the testimony contradicts witness statements, what exactly is left to build a case on? She didn't look smug. She wasn't there to gloat. She looked tired, like a woman who had fought too many of these battles already and knew the playbook better than anyone in that room. But then, Eleanor pulled out something no one saw coming. Video evidence that rewrote the entire case. Eleanor slid a small USB drive across the table. This, she said, was recorded by a college student named Miguel Santiago. He was filming from the second floor of the parking garage across from City Hall. I've already submitted it to the clerk for review. Judge Thorne squinted. And what exactly does this video show? Eleanor answered plainly, the truth. The clerk inserted the drive into the court screen system. A grainy but steady video flickered to life on the monitor. You could see the protest unfolding below, people shouting, holding signs, police officers forming a barricade. Then, there she was, Eleanor, clearly visible, her tiny frame weaving through the crowd. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't raising her fists. She wasn't linking arms or chanting. She was waving her hands down, an emotion familiar to anyone who'd ever broken up a fight. Back up! Her voice rang out, surprisingly loud and clear for a woman her age. Don't push. Stay calm. The video caught it all. She placed herself between 2 officers and a group of teenagers holding cardboard signs. She was turned toward the crowd, not the police. Her hands were up again, palms out. A moment later, one officer lunged, another joined. They grabbed her arms, yanked her backwards, and cuffed her. She didn't resist. She didn't flinch. The room was dead silent. After 30 more seconds of footage, the screen went black. Eleanor turned to Judge Thorne. The officer's report said I stormed the line, encouraging others to resist. But in that video, I was the only one trying to stop the panic from escalating. That video wasn't provided by the prosecution, even though Officer Dempsey knew about it. I'm told Miguel gave a copy to the department the day after the protest. He never heard back. Thorne looked down at the bench, jaw stiff. Mr. Cole, Did your office receive this footage? Preston Cole's face was pale. I was not made aware, Your Honor. Eleanor didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Mr. Santiago said he gave it to a plainclothes officer who told him it wasn't needed. I suppose they had their narrative already figured out. A woman in the gallery whispered, Lord have mercy. The judge's gavel came down once, not with force, just enough to reclaim the moment. He looked at Eleanor like he was seeing her for the first time. You said you retired in 2003? She nodded. That's right. After 20 years of seeing how cases like this play out. He leaned forward. Why come back now? Her voice softened. Because I was tired of waiting for someone else to care. She took a few steps forward, not for drama, but because she couldn't sit still anymore. I thought maybe if I just played by the rules, kept my head down in retirement, read the paper, volunteered here and there, maybe the world would figure itself out. But the truth is, Mr. Cole isn't new. Officer Dempsey isn't new. This system, this habit of charging first, questioning later, that's not new. I've been watching it since I was 30 years old, and it hasn't slowed down. She turned to the jury, her eyes searching the rows. I didn't come here today to put on a show. I came because if this courtroom decides my guilt based on the word of people who didn't tell the whole truth, then what happens to the next person? Who doesn't have credentials, or a witness video, or the nerve to speak up? Nobody answered. Even Cole had gone completely still. Judge Thorne leaned back slowly in his chair. But just when it seemed things couldn't get worse for the prosecution, Eleanor brought the room to a full stop. Eleanor reached into her handbag again, carefully, deliberately, and pulled out a folded document. It wasn't Flashino heavy legal stamp or highlighted text, just a clean police transcript on standard letter paper. I'd like to read something into the record, she said calmly. From Officer Michael Evans, who was present that afternoon but not called as a witness. Judge Thorne narrowed his eyes. Was this statement submitted to the court before today? Eleanor shook her head once. It was not. I obtained it yesterday through a records request. It wasn't easy. I had to call in a few old favors. She smoothed the paper out and began reading. Quote, I arrived on scene at approximately 6:15 p.m. I observed Eleanor Hayes moving through the crowd, repeatedly telling people to step back and remain peaceful. I did not witness her push, shout aggressively, or instigate. When I saw her being taken into custody, I was surprised, as she was the only individual I observed trying to calm tensions. She looked up, letting the silence breathe. End quote. Preston Cole shifted in his seat. His hands fumbled briefly with a pen. That officer wasn't part of the arresting team. His observation lacks credibility. Eleanor finished for him, her tone sharper now. Then why did your office choose not to include his name in the witness list at all? Not even as a footnote? You claim to be after the facts, Mr. Cole, but the facts that contradict your version are quietly swept aside. The judge interjected. Mr. Cole, can you confirm whether Officer Evans was interviewed during the investigation? Cole hesitated. I'd have to check the original intake file. No need, Eleanor said. I checked. He filed his statement the night of the arrest. It was signed, time-stamped, and buried. Never reviewed, never mentioned. She stepped toward the jury again. This case was never about disorder. It was about making an example of someone who didn't look like a threat, but didn't fall in line either. She pointed gently toward the screen, still dark from the earlier footage. They didn't expect someone like me to speak. And once I did, they try to label me disruptive. That word gets used when people don't want to admit they're uncomfortable being challenged. One of the jurors, a man in his 60s with a neatly trimmed beard, rubbed the bridge of his nose and looked down. The others just stared at Eleanor, fully present, fully engaged. Judge Thorne looked exhausted now, not because of Eleanor, but because of what was unraveling in front of him. Your Honor, she said softly, I would like to request that all charges be dropped based on procedural misconduct, incomplete evidence submission, and the suppression of exculpatory testimony. The judge said nothing for a moment. He folded his hands and stared at the bench, tapping one finger rhythmically. The courtroom waited. Alma didn't press. She didn't need to. Finally, Thorne looked up. I'll take the request under advisement and reconvene after a recess. Eleanor nodded and returned to her seat. Her hands were steady. No notes, no co-counsel, no fanfare. Just decades of experience and a stubborn belief that the truth had weight, even when no one wanted to carry it. As the courtroom emptied for recess, Preston Cole didn't get up right away. He stayed in his seat, looking like someone who'd finally realized he'd brought a spoon to a gunfight. And when the judge tried to steer the case back under control, Eleanor did something that silenced the room. When the court reconvened, the energy in the room had shifted. Gone were the chuckles and smug whispers. Even the gallery sat straighter, quieter, like they'd been pulled into something heavier than anyone had prepared for. Judge Thorne returned with a solemn expression. His gavel tapped once, almost like a formality. And then Eleanor stood. She didn't launch into legal jargon. She didn't raise her voice. She simply spoke. "There was a time," she began, "when I used to rush into courtrooms with 20 case files in my arms, wearing the same suit 3 times a week because that's all I could afford." That was 1987. Chicago Public Defender's office on West Harrison Street. Her voice wasn't shaking, but there was a heaviness behind it. "I once defended a 17-year-old named David Carter, arrested for matching the description of a purse snatcher. He was walking home from school with a trumpet case. The officer said he looked nervous. You know what nervous means when you're young, black, and walking alone. The room held its breath. They found no purse, no eyewitness, no confession. Just the fact that he ran when 2 officers jumped out of an unmarked van." She let her words linger. "I spent 5 weeks fighting that case. 5 weeks digging through evidence no one else wanted to look at. Found a receipt for a school lunch inside his backpack, timestamped 10 minutes before the crime occurred. Case was dismissed. But by then, David had missed his final band competition, lost his scholarship. Eleanor's eyes were fixed on the jury, not to guilt them, but to show them something real, something permanent. Cases like his stayed with me, not because they were rare, but because they were common. Too common." She inhaled deeply, grounding herself. "You think I came here today because I like arguing? Because I miss the long hours and short patience of courtrooms like this?" She turned toward Judge Thorne, speaking gently. "No, Your Honor. I came because too many people like David don't get a second shot. Because if I had stayed quiet, if I had just gone home that day when the protest started to spiral, some other kid might have ended up in this chair. Someone who couldn't defend themselves." She stepped closer to the bench. "And I'm tired of pretending that silence saves us." Thorne now had his hands clasped, his pale palms stark against the dark wood of the bench. He didn't speak. He looked like he wanted to. Eleanor shifted her gaze toward Cole. "You're young," she said to him without cruelty. "Maybe you still believe the system is fair until proven otherwise. But that's not how it works. The system is flawed until someone demands better. That's the job. And if you're not willing to carry that burden, then you're in the wrong courtroom." Cole's face flushed, but he didn't respond. He couldn't. Eleanor returned to her seat. The silence didn't break. A minute later, Judge Thorne cleared his throat and glanced toward the clerk, but not before rubbing his temple like the weight of his own history had started pressing on him too. He opened his mouth to speak, but then paused. Not for drama, just uncertainty. It was the first time in years he looked like a man who didn't trust the words in front of him. "I've reviewed the evidence submitted by the defense," he said finally, "including the witness video, the police transcript, and the timing discrepancies." His voice wavered, but only slightly. This case was not handled properly, and it is the court's opinion that moving forward would be unjust. You could hear a pin drop. "MS. Hayes," he said, voice tighter now, "this court dismisses all charges." There was no applause, no outburst, just a stunned silence, like people were waiting for someone to tell them what to feel. Eleanor didn't smile. She closed her bag, stood up, and nodded not out of victory, but out of respect. And that's when Judge Thorne, for the first time in years, didn't know what to say. Outside the courthouse, the sunlight hit hard, dry and sharp, like it always was in Bakersfield around noon. Eleanor stepped down the courthouse stairs slowly, not because she was frail, but because she'd learned long ago that there's no reason to rush through the moments that matter. She clutched her handbag under one arm, her shoes scuffed softly against the pavement. Reporters waited like wolves on the sidewalk, their cameras already rolling, microphones pushed out like bait. Most of them weren't even here when the trial started, but word had spread about the retired black woman who walked into court alone and walked out with the truth. "MS. Hayes, are you planning to sue the city? Did you expect the case to be dismissed? Do you consider yourself an activist?" She didn't answer, not because she was avoiding the spotlight, but because she'd said what needed to be said already, and that courtroom had been the only audience that mattered. At the bottom of the steps, a small cluster of people waited. They weren't reporters. They were younger late teens, maybe early 20s. Hoodies, backpacks, worn sneakers. Eleanor recognized one of them as Miguel Santiago, the student who had filmed the video. He held his phone down at his side now, not recording, just watching her. One of the girls stepped forward. She looked barely out of high school, eyes bright and nervous. MS. Hey, she said, I want to be a lawyer someday. Like you. Eleanor smiled for the first time all day. It wasn't a grand smile, just enough to show she was listening. The girl continued. That was the first time I saw someone actually win in court like that. You didn't just fight, you taught. Eleanor looked her in the eye. Then remember what you saw. Because it won't always look that way. Most days, it'll feel like pushing a brick wall uphill with your bare hands. And no one will clap for you. But you push anyway. Miguel spoke next. The system never expected someone like you to know how to fight back. I know, she said quietly. They counted on it. Another boy spoke up. Can we learn from you? Like, shadow you or interview you or something. You've seen stuff we haven't even read about yet. Eleanor looked at the group, pausing. She wasn't trying to be anyone's hero, but she saw something in their eyes she hadn't seen in a long time. Hope mixed with restlessness. That old fire. She adjusted the strap of her bag. I don't do social media. I don't have a website. But I still remember how to teach. You bring your questions, I'll bring my coffee. The group broke into quiet laughter. Miguel's eyes lit up. Behind them, Judge Thorne stood at the top of the stairs, watching everything. He wasn't flanked by deputies now. No robe, just a blazer and a loose tie. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to speak, but then he didn't. He just watched Eleanor turn the corner with the kids, her figure slowly shrinking into the afternoon sun. Back inside, Preston Cole sat at his desk with his case files open but untouched. His expression had changed no smugness, no sharp edges. He watched Eleanor's bar card sit quietly on the bench, forgotten for the moment. And then he reached for it, not to question it, but to read it hat name, that date, that lifetime of knowledge. The courtroom was empty now, but something had shifted in him. Maybe not enough to change everything overnight, but maybe enough to make him pause next time. Because for the first time, he had seen the difference between winning a case and understanding justice. But what Eleanor said, next to those kids, left them with more than legal advice. It gave them a reason to believe. The diner on Union Avenue was nearly empty when Eleanor sat down with the kids that evening. She chose the booth by the window, the same one she'd sat in years ago when she used to meet with nervous clients who didn't trust courtrooms. The light from the setting sun streaked across the cracked leather seats and turned the Formica table soft and gold. Miguel ordered coffee, even though he didn't drink it. The girl her name was Aisha asked for iced tea and pulled out a notebook already full of scribbles. The others leaned in, as if something sacred was about to happen. But Eleanor didn't launch into a lecture. She stirred her cup slowly, then said, You know the first thing they teach you in law school? Miguel blinked. The Constitution? She smiled faintly. No, they teach you how to read a case file without getting emotional. How to separate the facts from the feelings. How to argue without letting it get under your skin. Aisha leaned forward. Is that a good thing? It's necessary, Eleanor said. But dangerous too, because if you do it long enough, you forget that behind every file is a person. And that person usually didn't ask to be there. She set her spoon down and looked each of them in the eye. Don't forget the people. A long silence followed. Not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. One of the boys, quiet until now, finally spoke. But how do you keep going when no one wants to listen? Eleanor exhaled slowly, the weight of that question pressing gently against her. You keep going because sometimes someone is listening, and they'll only hear the truth if you say it out loud, even when your voice shakes, even when the room turns cold. Aisha scribbled quickly in her notebook, but Eleanor shook her head. Don't write this down. Live it. Make mistakes, mess it up, but stay honest. Miguel leaned back in a booth. You ever regret it? Staying in the fight this long? Eleanor paused. Her fingers traced the rim of her cup. Every time I lost a client who should have walked free, I regretted it. Every time I saw an officer lie without blinking, I regretted it. And every time I watched a jury choose comfort over truth, I asked myself if I was just wasting time. She looked out the window for a moment. But then I remember the ones who did walk. The ones who were heard. The ones who called me 5 years later just to say thank you. That's what matters. Miguel nodded slowly. Eleanor finished her coffee and stood. The check was already covered. Aisha had quietly slipped the bills under the sugar jar. As they stood outside on the sidewalk, the kids hesitated like they didn't want the night to end. Eleanor turned to them. Y'all want to change the system, right? They nodded. Then don't just study it. Challenge it. Ask better questions. Call out silence. Use your mind. Use your feet. Use your pen. And when someone tells you to wait your turn, ask them why they think it's not your turn already. Aisha wiped her eyes. The others didn't speak. They just watched her, really watched her. Then Eleanor said one last thing. I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who refused to be quiet. And with that, she walked toward the bus stop, not looking back. Some stories aren't about headlines. They're about reminders. That power doesn't always come in a robe, or behind a bench, or from someone who speaks the loudest. Sometimes it comes from a woman in a cardigan, holding the system in her hands like she's done it before. Because she has. And when people ask what justice looks like, they should remember her name, Eleanor Hayes. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe wisdom doesn't come with a dress code, hit that subscribe button. We've got more stories to tell, real ones that remind us who we are.